If you've listened to Brewlosophy at all, you know how much we love Imperial Yeast. The company was founded on the ideal that if you're going to do something, do it right. From their Imperial Pitch-Right pouches, packing a whopping 200 billion cells of healthy and viable yeast in each pouch, to their commitment to commercial customers, guaranteeing 10 of their most popular strains are in stock for orders up to 20 liters, or the shipping is free, Imperial Yeast does it right. No more worrying about whether you need to make a starter or propagate your yeast prior to pitching. Imperial Yeast makes it easy for the home brewer and commercial brewer to obtain direct pitches at proper rates when you need it. To place a commercial order or to get more information about everything that Imperial Yeast has to offer, head on over to imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Brewers are always experimenting with new hop varieties and techniques to find innovative ways of infusing juicy and tropical aromas into their hoppy beers. But in the past few years, yeast has become a bigger part of the conversation when it comes to hop aroma. I'm your host, Kay Jobe, and that intro is a direct quote from the introduction to a new brewer article, that's the publication from the Brewers Association, from Lance Shaner and Laura Burns of Omega Yeast, called Thiolized Yeast 101. By now, you've surely heard of yeasts that have been modified to increase thiol character. Maybe you've listened to more than one episode of this show where we've talked about thiols and how to increase that tropical, juicy aroma and flavor through hoppy means. And of course, these styles are really in style right now. But a few months back, Laura and I were chatting about how blasting thiols might be appropriate in some cases, but more often than not, the truly great thiol beers are still well balanced. They're not just thiol bombs. So Laura is joining me in the lab today, along with industry veteran Mitch Steele, to talk about thiols and how to balance them, especially when using thiolized yeasts. So we'll start with some of the basics laid out in the new brewer article by Lance and Laura. We'll talk about thiols, we'll talk about how thiolized yeast works, and we'll almost immediately jump into Mitch's experiences trying out and brewing with thiolized yeast. So there's something for everyone in this episode, and I hope you'll enjoy it. If you haven't yet signed up to become a patron, please consider doing so. By becoming a patron of Brewlosophy, you get awesome rewards like access to Brewlosophy contributor recipes, new discounts each month to YakimaValleyHops.com, and for $3 a month, access to a monthly live Q&A session with a special guest from the brewing industry. Becoming a patron is easy. Once you've contributed at that $3 a month level or higher, you get access to the private Patreon Facebook page where all of the previous Q&A sessions are available to watch. So guests like Vinny Chilurzo, John Palmer, and of course the Brewlosopher himself, Marshall Schott. And you just missed Brewlosophy contributor Alex Shanks-Abel. The self-described cheapskate brewer appeared recently on the Brewlosophy show and then again on the most recent Patreon Q&A, sharing some of their tips and tricks for avoiding all of those expensive processes, ingredients, and equipment. And they're also a wealth of knowledge about beer and brewing. So this recording is available on the private Patreon Facebook page. All the information that you need to get access to this awesome resource is available at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. So go check it out. I want to pause again and say another big thank you to everyone who's left a rating or review of the show. These ratings really are meaningful. I care immensely about how you like the show, and this is one of the easiest ways for me to hear from you. You can also send an email to cade@brewlosophy.com with show feedback. But of course, every review helps us improve the show. We have these Applying the Science episodes with Jordan because of listener reviews. And so if you haven't yet left a rating or review, please take a moment to help us out. All right, feedback this week is from listener Will, who wrote in with another question about episode 150, tracking fan to improve flavor stability. And he writes, I think you mentioned the New Belgium study had 3 experiment beers finishing around the same ppm of fan, despite starting off with different amounts. Forgive me if I missed it, but did the New Belgium study all use the same yeast strain? It would stand to reason, yeast being a living organism, that each yeast strain may have a different uptake level of fan during a fermentation. I've often wondered if some of the O2 sensitivity we see in hazy IPA may be due to the yeast strain being used and not just the amount of fan and cold side O2 introduced. I believe I've witnessed this effect when doing a yeast comparison using the same batch of wort. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Well, cool. Thanks, Will, for sending in that question. And so I did reach out to Stacy and got a response from her. She says, "Hi, Cade. In this experiment, 3 different yeast strains were in fact used. The Imperial IPA was Cal Ale, California Ale. The Lager was an Augustiner strain, and the Hazy was London Ale 3. The Haze and Imperial were dry hopped, which did introduce more fan, and the Lager had a protein rest, which definitely, this is Cade right now. This is not Stacy, but I was going to say those things would definitely result in differing amounts of fan being in the wort. And then Stacy says the yeast strains absolutely do uptake fan differently depending on their fermentation kinetics and if it's a healthy fermentation or not. I'm not sure what he means by O2 sensitivity. I think he's going for the hazies tend to age more than other beers, ? If he's worried about eliminating too much fan on the hot side, he can supplement his fermentation with brew tabs, which will add fan but not amino acids. Cool. Thanks for the info, Stacy, and for the question, Will. So yeah, it sounds like there were 3 different yeasts consuming different amounts of fan because, as we mentioned, the lager had a protein rest and so thus higher amounts of fan. But all 3 beers still finished around the same ppm, which is fascinating. And that was something that I think Kira and Stacy also found fascinating as well. And then, Will, your comment about O2. Yeah, I mean, the reduced shelf stability of hazies exposed to oxygen might be yeast strain dependent. I mean, especially, I would say, at low levels of oxygen exposure. Although at some point, if you get too much oxygen exposure, any differences between yeast strain would just be a result of the oxygen. But I think it is possible, right? I mean, the compounds that yeast produce during fermentation is what is going to determine a lot of that shelf stability. And so if those yeasts are producing different compounds, which makes sense, right? If they're consuming fan differently and producing different side products, secondary metabolites, then yeah, maybe there would be different levels of exposure or levels of sensitivity to exposure to oxygen. I don't think I've ever seen an experiment looking at that. So that's just sort of me pontificating. But it certainly would be cool to see like shelf stability of different yeast strains in like different exposure levels to oxygen. That would be fun to see if anybody's out there is willing to do that research. So Will, thanks for the feedback. Stacy, thank you for the response. And I'll be back in a few minutes with Dr. Laura Burns and Mitch Steele talking about thiolized yeast. The new and improved Brewbuilt X3 Unitank conical fermenter has arrived, and I'm here to tell you it's a thing of beauty that comes with some awesome features, like an 8-inch tri-clamp lid in place of the complicated band clamp, 4 crossbar reinforced legs to improve stability while giving more access to valves, horizontal ports on the cone that allow for smaller batch sizes, and an oversized 3-inch bottom port with butterfly valve and tri-clamp flex chamber collection vessel. Brew like a pro at home with the Brewbuilt X3 Unitank. Head over to morebeer.com right now to learn more about this rad piece of gear and pick one up for yourself.
Worried about letting someone else pick out the perfect avocado for your perfect impress them on the third date guacamole? Well, good thing Instacart shoppers are as picky as you are. They find ripe avocados like it's their guac on the line. They are milk expiration date detectives. They bag eggs like the 12 precious pieces of cargo they are. So let Instacart shoppers overthink your groceries so that you can overthink what you'll wear on that third date. Download the Instacart app to get free delivery on your first 3 orders while supplies last. Minimum $10 per order. Additional terms apply.
Transform your home in one weekend and get big savings on everything for your project at Menards. Menards carries the largest selection of Purdy painting tools you need to get your painting project started. From brushes, paint, roller covers, and even paint kits. Hurry in and save big money on Purdy painting supplies. Get everything you need for your painting project at Menards. Plus, check out Menards.com for more great deals happening now.
Save big money at Menards.
Prescription products require completion of an online medication consultation with an independent healthcare provider through the LifeMD platform and are only available if prescribed. Subscription required. Individual results may vary. Additional restrictions apply. Read all warnings before using GLP-1s. Side effects may include a risk of thyroid C-cell tumors. Do not use GLP-1s if you or your family have a history of thyroid cancer.
If you've struggled for years to lose weight and have given up hope, did you know you can now access GLP-1 prescription medications at TryLifeMD.com? We're now offering eligible patients online access to GLP-1s, the breakthrough prescription medication that can help you lose body fat and weight. Listen to what people are saying.
It's fun to put on jeans that you couldn't get into 6 months ago.
Every morning, I look forward to getting on the scale.
For anybody who's struggling with their weight, it's a godsend.
And here's the best part. Your insurance may cover 100% of the cost of your medication. So go to trylifemd.com to have your eligibility checked right now. Get started today at trylifemd.com. That's trylifemd.com.
Many New Age IPAs are known for their intense tropical fruitiness, which traditionally comes from heavy hop loads in the whirlpool and dry hop, with hops that are high in free thiols. These pungent aromatic compounds give juicy IPAs some of their intense fruitiness, but yeast can also play a role through biotransformation, or more recently, through liberation of bound thiols in malt and other sources outside of hops. Today I'm in the lab speaking with Dr. Laura Burns from Omega Yeast and Mitch Steele of New Realm Brewing Company about Thiolized yeasts. So Laura, welcome back to the Brew Lab.
Thanks, Cade. Awesome to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back. And Mitch, welcome to the lab for the first time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, so Laura, Thiolized yeasts are becoming really popular for adding that intense thiol character to beer, and it's got to be fun seeing an innovation like this doing well in the market.
Absolutely. It's fun to see, the idea from the bench into actual beer and be able to go out and have beers with people, have beer, friends even brewing with it, sharing kind of their feedback real time. It's definitely been really fun.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I see a lot of. I'm starting to see it all the time, brewed with thiolized yeasts, like right on here. Here's Cosmic Punch, or, any of the other thiolized yeast strains that you guys have put forth there at Omega. And Mitch, of course, as a brewer, it's got to be fun playing with these yeasts as a new ingredient. I mean, are consumers still looking for that intense tropical flavor in beer?
Yeah, I think they are. In the Southeast in particular, it seems like anything that's kind of got some sort of tropical theme or tropical hints or accents to it seems to work really well. I'm not sure about the rest of the country, but certainly where I'm at in Georgia, and we sell a lot of beer in Virginia as well, it does well. Anything tropical or anything kind of hints of tropical, or even if the name is somewhat tropical, it's a selling point for a beer. So I think that is a good flavor right now for us to be in.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm originally from Texas, so I know that like hot heat, people love those tropical flavors and aromas. I mean, there's a place for the light lager. Don't get me wrong. That crisp and quenchable is there too. But if looking for the fruit flavors, that tropical definitely is something that I sought after. Okay, well, I always like to start the show doing some brief guest introductions. So Laura, of course, you are the Director of Research and Development at Omega Yeast. So anything fun you guys have been working on since we last talked?
The fun stuff, actually, we'll have a paper out in ASBC coming soon on our yeast haze studies. So
cool.
Getting down to the genetics of haze. So looking forward to that. That one will be fun to see in print.
Yeah, that's an exciting one. And that was a fun episode that we talked about, that HZY1 gene, discovering that gene and how it relates to haze, which is cool. And now, I even saw recently you guys have released some homebrew strains as well, even at the homebrew level, some of these GMO yeasts.
Yeah, so we basically termed the technology where we remove this haze from yeast, or remove the haze gene, HZ1. We termed it Lumina technology. And so we have several strains where, the haze that they typically make that might be less desirable in certain styles is now gone.
Cool. Yeah, that's exciting. I mean, I know I have a lot of homebrew friends that have been like, hey, did you see Omega finally release these yeasts? And like, yeah, let's get after it and go play with it, which is cool. Now, Mitch, you are, I believe I got your title right, although I might have gotten it wrong. Head brewer at New Realm Brewing?
Yeah, I'm the brewmaster at New Realm. I'm a co-founder of the company. We've been in business for almost 7 years now.
Yeah, well, congratulations for that. And you have a storied career as a brewer. Can you share some of your brewing background with listeners?
Yeah, I've been in the business a long time. I started in the late 1980s. I was a fan of craft beer and breweries like Sierra Nevada. I was living in the Bay Area. I started at a little brew pub in the south or the Central Coast area of California, inland from Monterey and Carmel, in a town called Hollister. Spent a few years doing that. Joined Anheuser-Busch in 1992, I believe it was, and my plan was to spend 5 years at Anheuser-Busch and learn as much as I could, and then get back into craft beer, or microbrewing as we called it back then. And I ended up spending 14 years at Anheuser-Busch. Did a lot of really cool things. I had some great experiences there. And after 16 years, I ended up taking a job at Stone Brewing Company in San Diego. So I moved from the East Coast out to the Southern California. And I spent 10 years running the brewing operation at Stone, which was an amazing experience. We grew from, 35, 40,000 barrels a year to over 350,000 barrels in the 10 years I was there. We opened up 2 new breweries, and we're in constant expansion mode, and really honed my skills with hops and got involved with the hop industry with Stone. And, it was just a pretty amazing experience. I left Stone in 2016 to help start up what became New Realm Brewing Company. I've been here ever since. I moved to Atlanta full time in 2019, and we just opened our 5th location. It's a brewery, kind of a blendery, aging facility, a lot of wood barrels and foeders and things like that in Greenville, South Carolina, which is about 2 hours northeast of Atlanta. It's a wonderful town. We're really thrilled. We just had our grand opening event last night, so it's been a lot of fun.
Well, cool. Well,
Congrats.
Congratulations. Yeah. That's really cool. And also, this is going to be fun too, right? Because you have a long career in the brewing industry. And one of the things I want to talk to you about today is how you've seen yeast and hops and this interaction change. Because, I'm guessing that the beers that were brewed back whenever you started in the early 90s and late 80s are totally different than some of the beers that are coming out today. I mean, they're still the tried and trues, right? The light lager has still got a special place in American hearts. But I'm sure things have changed. And it's pretty cool to talk about like new innovation, right, in the terms of these thiolized yeasts, but then also talk about where we came from and where we are now, and how to use these new yeasts with experiences that we've learned over the past over a storied brewing career. So I'm pretty excited to talk about it. And Laura, of course, you and Lance Shaner recently wrote an article in The New Brewer, which is, of course, the trade publication for the Brewers Association, called Thiolized Yeasts 101. And that's what was the impetus for this story. You and I were having a conversation, about that article. We wanted to talk about balance when using thiolized yeast, and also, get into a primer on thiols, but also talk about how best to brew with these yeasts. What can we do with them? And so, Mitch, I'm hoping you'll be able to share a lot of your story and experience in that way as well. Thiols, of course, are great, but in excess, they can cause flavors that people don't necessarily like. So I'm interested to see what you guys think about those. Mitch, I want to ask you a question then to start. When did you first learn about thiols, and when did you start playing with them at New Realm?
Oh, I don't remember exactly when it was. I remember the first one that the first yeast that we used was Cosmic Punch, and it was shortly after it came out. And we jumped on it. And it was interesting because we had and we still do, we have a beer that we brew once a quarter for a special account. And we used it as kind of an innovation platform for us, where we got to try different things. It was always some hazy or juicy IPA. And, that was our opportunity to really trial a lot of different yeast strains and a lot of different hops and see which biotransformed well. And when we learned about Cosmic Punch, we pretty quickly said, okay, the next batch of this beer, it was called, what was it called? I'm drawing a blank. It was called Haze Lab. That was what the series was called. And we've changed the name on it now, but it was called Haze Lab, and we were doing one every 3 months. So when I read about this yeast and heard about it and learned about it, I was like, I think the next Haze Lab, we need to give this a shot. And so that was, gosh, I don't know, 4 years ago. I don't remember exactly when. It was a few years ago. And that's how we got started. And then I remember talking with Laura at some MBA conferences and things like that about it, and got more excited about the whole idea. And we've had a lot of fun with it since.
Yeah, Laura, is that whenever Cosmic Punch came out around 3 or 4 years ago?
Yeah, I referenced it in that New Brew article. I can't even remember when I graduated from college. But yeah, it was in that range of like 3 years ago that Cosmic Punch came out. And those were the early days that was really everybody figuring it out. So it was fun to have people like Mitch playing with it at that point.
Exactly. Well, Laura, can you remind us a little bit? I mean, we've talked about thiols on the show before, but I want to know a little bit, like, what are thiols? Where do they come from? What do they do in beer?
Well, thiols aren't new to beer, and Mitch knows this working in hops. Obviously, the predominant really potent aroma compounds of some of the newer varieties tend to hone in on these thiol compounds. And, it has been more recently studied, I think, over the last basically 2 decades of the brewing scene, but also in wine. What these key signature aromas are, how thiols kind of integrate in with esters, and just understanding how those tropical aromas come through. So really, thiols are relatively new, both in the understanding of how they impact sensory, but also in just understanding how to measure them, create them, where their sources are, how yeast interact with materials and produce thiols. So just a lot of new work in the last 2 decades on that.
Yeah. So where do thiols usually come from? I mean, I know most people, when they're thinking about hazy IPAs, that tropical fruity flavor, they're thinking from hops. Is that where thiols come from?
Yeah. So thiols are compounds that are really just ubiquitous in nature. They're kind of all over the place in tropical fruits, also in marijuana and coffee. Yeah, some of the key aroma compounds in all these come from thiols because they're very potent and impactful. Even with cabbage, broccoli, and onions, those are some of the less desirable thiols, especially in beer, but those are thiol compound aromas as well. So the ones we talk about mainly when we're talking about thiolized yeast, the thiolized yeast are able to access and release from our raw materials in beer are the tropical aromas, so guava, passion fruit, grapefruit, caddy, like the Simcoe kind of caddy aroma as a thiol. And those are the ones that are highly sought after in hops as well. And, dank aromas from hops are similar to the dank aromas of cannabis, and that's coming from thiol compounds as well.
Oh, wow. Okay. So a lot of those flavors are coming from thiols. Are hops the only source? I'm sorry. A lot of those thiol flavors are coming from hops, but are hops the only source of thiols? Can you get it from other places in beer?
If you're using fruit, obviously, like fruit flavoring, you can bring in those thiol aromas from guava puree, for example. But yeah, from the raw materials typically used in beer, hops are the only one that supply the free thiol.
The free thiols. And so this is the key component, right? Free thiols. Those are the ones that are readily, I don't know the exact word, but like readily expressible in beer. You can smell them by just adding hops to beer, right? Without doing anything else. But there are a whole bunch of what we also call bound thiols that exist in beer.
That's right. Yeah, the bound thiols are aromaless. They basically are just part of cellular metabolism in plants. Lots of plants have these bound thiol aroma compounds, and very few plants will release them. And that occurs often in like the bud of a hop cone, cone of a hop, I guess, sorry. Or the fruit as they're ripening. Those thiols become aromatic and released from their precursor form.
Mm-hmm. And that's another one too. I in reading your New Brew article, you mentioned like wine, for example, is a place where there's a lot of bound thiols, but relatively few free thiols. In fact, almost no free thiols in wine grapes.
That's right. Yeah, and when we were early in our kind of studies in yeast, this was the major source of information we had, is how thiols were released in fermentation in the wine, world. So we learned a lot from kind of what had been laid as a foundation in the wine world, and kind of jumped off there and made our way into beer.
Yeah, yeah. And you also mentioned just a few minutes ago that how sensitive humans are to thiols. I mean, I had a conversation with Cecile Chanot on a previous podcast where she said that like one drop of a thiol in an Olympic-sized swimming pool is potent enough for humans to smell. So how sensitive are we to these compounds?
Well, very sensitive. Well, we've had some aroma spikes that we've had in house that you can't open in the building. They are extremely impactful, and my perspective on an Olympic-sized pool really was put in when I thought about the volume is actually 21,000 barrels of beer.
Oh, wow.
So like if you're thinking about an annual, like kind of like a moderate mid-sized brewery, annual production of 20,000 barrels, that is what you're talking about when you're talking about a drop.
Holy moly.
Of like one of those thiol compounds would be the aromatic threshold.
So one drop in 21,000 barrels of beer.
Mm-hmm.
Holy moly. Yeah, that really puts it in perspective, doesn't it? I mean, the Olympic-sized swimming pool is a great analogy too, but wow, I mean, you're talking about the entire production capacity of a good chunk of American brewers out there.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's pretty impressive. Well, one other question too, and you touched on this already a little bit, but are all thiols the same? Do they all smell like fruity and tropical, those flavors that Mitch was talking about that people, especially in the Southeast, really like?
Not all thiols are the same. There's definitely crossover in the tropical theme between a lot of them that we're talking about and hops, but there's distinct kind of top notes on them. So with a couple of them we'll talk about today, this 3SH thiol or 4MSP thiol. The 3SH is primarily more guava, grapefruit driven. The 4MSP is rhubarb, grapefruit, and caddy. So you'll get crossover in them. They both will be recognizable as tropical and thiol-like, but you'll definitely start to sway towards different descriptors when talking about them.
So those are kind of the key ones that we're looking at when we're talking about those tropical flavors, the 3SH and 4MSP.
Yes, and there's another ester of 3SH called 3SHA, which we measure a lot because it's very impactful as well and kind of drives more of the passion fruit even than the 3SH does.
So are those then the thiol characteristics that the thiolized yeasts are targeting at?
Yeah, and those are kind of key aromas in Southern Hemisphere hops or New World hops.
Yeah.
Those compounds are in those as well. And when, if you want kind of like a really good sensory exercise, the like most recent vintages of like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc are like massively loaded up with these compounds. So those are like overtaking and very obvious in those wines. So those are good to try.
Oh, that's fun. Yeah. And not like any listeners of this podcast need another reason to try, wines or beers, to do some sensory. We're always happy to do that in our industry, right? I'm happy to do some sensory evaluation. And so Mitch, then I have a question for you. So we've got, hops that have a large portion of free thiols. And I mean, I think we've seen, especially on the East Coast, people just dumping loads and loads of hops into whirlpool and dry hop and trying to drive that intense fruity flavor. Where do you see thiolized yeasts fitting into this?
It's interesting. There were a couple of different angles we were looking at. Number one is just to have a unique flavor attribute in the beer that we weren't able to get with a traditional, hop or in a fruit addition or things like that. And I think the yeast derived thiol expression is a little bit different in beer and unique, and we like that. We thought it was just really interesting to see. The other piece that was interesting for us is using the thiols released from the yeast activity as a supplement to the flavors that we were already trying to get in the beer. And that was a really important factor for us. And we did a lot of things with, we were talking about tropical fruit flavored beers and we have beers that we have actually, we're adding fruit to, that we looked at, we looked at the Star Party yeast in particular as being able to help us reduce our fruit loads in the beer and still maintain flavor. And that was a really important thing for us.
Oh, that's an interesting point there, right? Because there are some beers that you're already adding fruit to, right? That are mm-hmm. for that purpose. And so thiolized yeast can actually play like a supplemental role there in augmenting or expressing certain types of fruit character that you desire.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's, I mean, given the current economic climate, just getting fresh fruit or fruit puree into the brewery is ridiculously expensive. And, and we've had a lot of pressure put on us over the last couple of years to work on our beer costs and not just make a beer without any regard to cost. And so we've been looking at techniques and ingredients that we could use to help make the beer a little bit more economical. And the Star Party yeast has been really helpful for us in that aspect. We've been doing a beer called Tropic Dream, which is a fruited wheat beer, and the yeast helped with that. And we've been doing some of these tropical double IPAs that you sell in convenience stores, and a double IPA by its very nature is an incredibly expensive beer, and when you sell it in a single 19.2 ounce can, you lose money on it if you just brew it
yeah
as a standard double IPA. And so we've used the thiolizing yeast in a lot of different ways, and we have one beer that just features it that we talk about it a lot, but it's helped us in other areas as well.
Yeah. I think about like a lot of times, homebrewers throwing like 5 pounds per barrel or something at or 6 pounds or more of hops at a beer. And sure, for a homebrewer, that's fine because that's really just, a few ounces of beer and you're going to be the one that drinks it and that's it. But those real economic concerns exist for brewers, right? Like you said, if you've got that package and you're throwing huge mountains of hops at it to try to express that thiol character, maybe there are other ways to do it. And I think I also hear you say a little bit, Mitch, too, that there's also not just necessarily like the cost savings, but this is really it's a tool. It's a tool that you would use just like anything else. You might adjust the alcohol, or you might adjust the, residual dextrin or the mouthfeel or any of these other characteristics. Yeast and the thiolized yeast plays that role too.
Yeah, it really does. It's been a lot of fun. It's allowed us to do things that we never thought of doing before with our beers, and it's helped us, as far as getting these beers out the door and being able to make a little bit of money on them when they were loss leaders for us at one time. So yeah, it's been great. I'm still most excited about just the beer that we do, that we market as a beer that's uses thiolized yeast, and we try to educate our sales team, our tap rooms, and our beer drinkers about how special and unique and innovative it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, and this is something that's a little bit of a challenge too, right? Because Laura, like pitching this back to you, when we talk about, the thiolized yeast and we get into sort of the weeds, like the mechanisms, right? The beta lyase and the IRC7 and versus the PAT B, which I want to ask you some questions about because I do want to get into those weeds a little bit, but it's a little bit of a challenge, right? Whenever we try to explain that to consumers.
Yeah. And I've talked to other customers as well, and they think they get basically glazed over eyes a lot of the time when they go into this with customers. And it is kind of you got to think about it. Do you really talk about like the nitty gritty of terpenes and the nitty gritty of, other aromatic esters from yeast? It's not something you typically relay to the consumer, but this is definitely just very special in its own. Like these thiol compounds are obvious. They can be polarizing. Customers start questioning the beer. So I think it's really important to let them know what's going on.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, polarizing is a great component. Well, I want to talk a little bit about, after the break about, some of these sensory characteristics and stuff like that. But that's definitely been my experience as well. Some of them come across as like this overripe fruit character, or like, not composty, but in that sort of realm or range. And I've always wondered, is that a threshold thing, or is that just certain thiols that were released? But before we digress down that rabbit hole, I did want to bring it back real quick to IRC7 and Pat B, because there was a really great explanation that you guys put in the New Brewer article, and so I wanted to ask you just briefly, what are these things? Beta lyase, IRC7, Pat B. Why do I keep talking about them, and why are they important for thiolized yeasts?
Okay, so we did talk about precursor and free thiols. So to get from a precursor to a free thiol, there's a bond between them that needs to be cleaved. It's a carbon-sulfur bond. So that free sulfur compound, the thiol, is then released once these enzymes act on the bond. So a beta lyase enzyme just is an enzyme capable of cleaving that precursor into the free thiol. Beta lyases are kind of, again, another thing found across nature, and they act on many different substrates. The ones that are in yeast, the IRC7 enzyme that Cosmic Punch uses, is actually involved in the central metabolism of yeast and its ability to acquire sulfur from the environment. So part of that is already tied into what yeasts do. And in wine, this enzyme gets activated during fermentation and actually results in thiol release. We found out in beer the hard way, trying a lot of the wine strains, trying wine hybrids, trying a lot of methods to coax yeast into making these flavors in beer. It was really complicated. And even if we were able to eke out a little bit, it certainly wasn't enough to stand out in the overall aroma profile of a beer, especially not a dry hop beer. So with IRC7, we actually basically turned it on and it kind of overexpressed it in beer fermentations. And that's what our Cosmic Punch strain is. So that isn't a super active beta lyase enzyme. It's kind of a puny one, but it is able to, once it's overexpressed and active in wine and in beer, it's able to convert over significant amounts of the precursor to reach the levels you'd see in free thiols and hops. So, if you were using like a Mosaic or something at 2 pounds per barrel, the amount of thiols you'd get from that are similar to the amount of thiols you could get with Cosmic Punch. And then as a very kind of over the top, this Pat B enzyme is an enzyme that comes from bacteria, and it's hyperactive beta lyase enzyme. So it's very able to free these thiol precursors. So it's much more potent. And when we talk about kind of that Olympic size pool example, the parts per trillion amounts that are aroma active, that's what's found, that drop in the Olympic size pool is kind of what you're thinking about at that level. But in the parts per billion, that's like shot glass in an Olympic size pool. So you're certainly stepping up the amount of thiols in the beer. But those are what we observe in Sauvignon Blanc wines and other things that are very thiol forward.
Okay.
Like natural sources like guava juice example would be at that level. So there's just a varying range based on the enzyme's activity, but these enzymes are capable of doing that same reaction where they take the precursor and release the free thiol from it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So these enzymes work, they are, like you said, there's some that are sort of like less active and then some that are hyperactive. So this IRC7 versus Pat B, I think what I heard you describe it is like IRC7, if you use that, it's intensity that's similar to hops. But if you then use a Pat B based thiolized yeast strain, then, it's going to be very intense, like maybe more intense than hops.
Exactly. And so more intense than hops, so it's straight up the levels that you would get in that guava juice or that Sauvignon Blanc wine. So it means that when you're dry hopping at 2 pounds per barrel or more, the intensity of the beer is going to be very over the top. So that thiol intensity needs to be able to kind of elevate and get in there and express in the level where you're going to detect it in the milieu of all of the other aromas.
Yeah, so that's sort of like an example. Like if you were dry hopping at 5 pounds per barrel or something like that, then IRC7 may not add a lot of thiol character because depending on the hops that you're using, you might already be getting a bunch of that thiol character from the hops, but Pat B might be able to then elevate even above that if that's what you're going for.
Yeah. And then as far as the application, with the Cosmic's Punch strain, a lot of people use the parent strain, like our version of London Ale 3 for hazy IPAs. And it works really well in all those beers. But adding just a little bit more IRC7 is driving it into the more tropical, or maybe what people perceive as hoppier style. So it's not overtaking those beers and it's not dominating, but it's certainly adding to them and augmenting them. So there's value there, like Mitch was kind of referring to, and helping to draw more intensity from malt and yeast and not have to maybe use as many hops.
Yeah. And I want to hear some about this, Mitch, and about how you've explored using thiols in the brewery. And Laura, you also mentioned in the New Brewer article a great benchtop experiment for looking at different sensory and physical characteristics of thiolized yeast. So let's take a quick break, and we'll start there whenever we come back. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Worried about letting someone else pick out the perfect avocado for your perfect impress them on the third date guacamole? Well, good thing Instacart shoppers are as picky as you are. They find ripe avocados like it's their guac on the line. They are milk expiration date detectives. They bag eggs like the 12 precious pieces of cargo they are. So let Instacart shoppers overthink your groceries so that you can overthink what you'll wear on that third date. Download the Instacart app to get free delivery on your first 3 orders while supplies last. Minimum $10 per order. Additional terms apply.
Brighten your home with big savings at Menards. Combine stylish lighting with LED technology with Fight Electric smart color-changing light bulbs. They have a full range of colors, allowing you to choose the perfect one to suit your mood. Save big on all Fight Lighting smart home products. Now at Menards. Shop our lighting options today, in-store and on menards.com.
Save big money at Menards.
We're in a fun period of innovation when it comes to yeast, with newly discovered and newly created strains that perform all kinds of brewing miracles, from diacetyl reduction to increased clarity to bold, aromatic, tropical flavors from terpenes and thiols. Now, Mitch, I know you've been having fun exploring these new types of yeast, but over your career, how has yeast changed since you started brewing?
Well, I think brewers understand it a lot better than they did early on. And it's interesting when I was doing the research for the book I wrote on India Pale Ale, it was interesting to see how little brewers knew about yeast in the 1700s, 1800s. That even that it was a living organism. They didn't know that. They just knew that it worked its magic in the beer and was necessary. And and just kind of the science that started developing in the Industrial Revolution and the understanding of yeast, really kind of took off in the latter part of the 1800s. But, when I started craft brewing, there wasn't a lot a variety of yeasts available, and a lot of brewers were using dried yeast, and some brewers who are a little bit more technically advanced were able to use slurries and maintain their own yeast cultures in their breweries, but most craft brewers weren't at that level. And it's interesting. I think when I was at Anheuser-Busch, and Anheuser-Busch, was an amazing place to work if you're kind of a beer science geek like I am, because there were so many people that were so intelligent and had done so much work on this kind of stuff. And I remember sitting in a tasting panel one time with a bunch of executives on the brewing team at Anheuser-Busch, and I was pretty low on the totem pole at that time, but it was cool to be there. But the conversation evolved into a discussion about yeast and how important is yeast to the flavor of beer. And and of course I chimed in and I said, well, it depends on the beer, and they said, well, stop that. We're talking about Budweiser, right? And like, okay. and the general consensus as we talked about this was, the flavor of a beer like Budweiser was, maybe 80-90% due to the fermentation characters that were developed. And it was a really interesting conversation that really stuck with me. And one of the things we did at Anheuser-Busch all the time was we tasted beers from Miller, we tasted beers from Coors, and we tasted our own and blind on taste panels. And it got to the point where you could just pick them out. And so anytime that, anybody said, all those beers taste the same, I was like, they all use different yeast strains. They all taste very different. And if you taste them blind against each other, you'll see what I'm talking about. But yeah, I'm kind of diverging a little bit, but I think, and I've been saying the last couple of years and just throwing this out there as kind of a fun comment to get conversations started, that the yeast is the new hop. And, for years, I mean, brewers, since the 90s had been focusing on all these great new hop varieties that have been coming out, and IPA innovation especially was fueled by using different hop varieties and new hop varieties and investing in hop breeding programs. And I still think that's really important, and it really does fuel a lot of innovation. But in the last few years, I think brewers have really started to get into what yeast can do to the flavor of a hoppy beer. And, with the development of the hazy IPA, I mean, I think that was a big step in the evolution of brewing. And, and then, now, there's so much research going on and so much work being done on yeast. The possibilities are endless. And it's super exciting to me as a brewer to be able to envision, these new flavors in beer that fit in with the overall flavor profile of the beer, but in another sense, they're new and exciting. And I think that's, for a business that's been fueled by innovation since the very start. And I think it's amazing, and I think it's an incredible opportunity for brewers to do some really exciting things.
Yeah, and I mean, wow, to be a fly on the wall in that conversation, right? To the brewing executives at Anheuser-Busch talking about yeast, back at that time, that would have been great to be able to be there and be a part of that. But yeah, I mean, how cool to see, the yeast becoming the new hops. Actually, that reminds me of a story too. I just heard a while back at the MBAA Seattle national meeting last year. Campbell Morrissey was giving a talk. He's the head brewer at Freem. He was giving a talk on barley malt. And he thanked everybody for attending the barley panel, because there was a hops panel at a competing time. And so he said, I want to thank you all for coming to the barley panel and not going out to the much sexier hops. But then if you walk down the hall and went to Laura's yeast panel, that was bursting at the seams. Now, people were all there for that. And that the topic of that was talking about, genetically modified yeasts, and also, not just GMOs, but also the future of yeast, traditional breeding and all this sort of stuff. So I think I agree with you, Mitch. I hadn't heard it expressed that way, but yeah, yeast are becoming the new hop, which is fun and exciting to see. And Laura, that's got to be exciting for you, right? I mean, of course, Thiolized yeast is making a big name amongst brewers and home brewers, but there is this element of balance that's required when using these thiol yeasts, right, to boost thiol character.
Yes, definitely. The hard thing about some of these innovative yeasts is that a lot of people need yeast to be the workhorse in the brewery, right? It has to be kind of easily kind of switched between styles and kind of fit into the repertoire of what the brewer wants to produce. So thiolized yeast don't necessarily do that for production. They're very distinct, so they're going to really fit into those hoppy or fruited styles. But a lot of people are making a lot of those styles now. So as much as it doesn't seem like it should be a house strain, these strains do develop into house strains. Because that's just so much of the production that some breweries are focused on. And I think, people are, like Mitch said, people are getting a lot more sophisticated with their yeast management. So they're understanding how to handle liquid cultures and manage their costs and the cost savings that they're offering in certain styles. If you're bringing in more flavor is also a good advantage.
Yeah, and you talk about the workhorse, right? I mean, the workhorse certainly for Anheuser-Busch used to be Budweiser, and it probably still is some combination of Budweiser or Bud Light. But for a lot of breweries out there, especially craft breweries, those IPAs are becoming the top seller. And so, Mitch, Laura shared a little bit about Psychedelic Rabbit. And so I wanted to ask you about that beer. How did it come about? How's it doing? And all that, the story of Psychedelic Rabbit.
Yeah, well, like I had said earlier, we had done some work with Cosmic Punch, and when Star Party came out, one of the things that we do a lot of innovation work in our Atlanta brewery, where I sit, and we have a 5-barrel pilot system, and we have a 20-barrel more production oriented brew house in there as well, and so we just brought the yeast in and wanted to try something with it. And we brewed a batch of beer on our big system and funneled 5 barrels off into a pilot system and really, really liked what the yeast was doing to the beer. And so I was excited, as I tend to get, about this kind of stuff, and, was running off to sales and say, here, try this, try this beer. And, do you think you can do something with it? And, so we worked on the beer, and we came out with this recipe that, we had a West Coast IPA. Our number one selling beer is a New England hazy IPA. And over time, we kind of positioned Psychedelic Rabbit as something in between, and it starts, and I thought it'd be fun. We started off in the brew house with a recipe. It's a very West Coast IPA recipe in the brew house, but then we used Star Party yeast to do the fermentation and develop this huge passion fruit and guava and bits of grapefruit kind of character in it. So we started positioning this beer as, kind of the bridge between hazy IPAs and West Coast IPAs, because that was really the only way we could get our taproom bartenders and our beer people in our company to really wrap their hands around what this beer was. And we came up, we're like, what do we call this beer? We can't call it West Coast. We can't call it New England or hazy. And we did filter it clear, so it's a relatively clear beer. And so we had this word floating around New Realm for a long time, and we've used it for a couple of beers, but the word is transcendent. And so we decided to call it a transcendent IPA because we wanted people to think of it as something completely different than anything else that was already being done.
Yeah.
And I believe in Laura, you would know better than me, but certainly in the Southeast, I think we were one of the first brewers to use a Star Party yeast in a regularly produced beer. And I remember telling you that we were going to do that, and I was so excited about it. And it's been At the start, it was a bit of a tough sell. It was a bit of a tough message because, like Laura said, people's eyes glaze over when you start getting into all this stuff. But,
Yeah.
with some work and trying to position it where we did, as kind of this West Coast IPA with this huge fruit character, it's working for us, and it's a good seller for us, and people, when they taste it, and we can explain in layman's terms what's going on with the beer and why those flavors are coming out the way they are, they get really interested in it, and it's been a good beer for us. It's either our number 2 or number 3 seller in all of our markets right now, which is huge.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's really big. And so something that was, relatively 2 or 3, maybe 4 years old. I'm not sure exactly, Laura, whenever Star Party came out, but to rocket from, just a 5 barrels pulled off of a 20 barrel system with a yeast pitched in to now a number 2 or, a top seller, let's say, for New Realm. That's impressive.
Yeah, I guess 2 years this would be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. That's well, congratulations to you, Mitch, for that, because that's awesome too. But Laura, that sort of speaks to, how some of these thiolized yeast can really be used to augment those beer flavors. And like Mitch said, it's not necessarily the hazy, right? It's not necessarily the West Coast, but it's somewhere in between. It's got its own unique flavor profile that it sounds like people are really digging.
Yeah. And, Mitch, obviously, it sounds like they went through a lot of just how do we relay this to our sales staff? How do we bring this to our customer? What's the right way to present it? But also in executing the beer and making that beer have balance. And that's what we are going to talk about a little bit of. It's just how to bring thiols into the overall beer and really boost aroma and come through in a really pleasant way. You don't want it to be overpowering. You don't want it to be underwhelming. And hitting it right on the spot is definitely a skill. And I don't know, Mitch, you got it right off the bat. So pretty awesome.
Yeah.
It took a lot of work. I mean, we tried a lot of different hop combinations and where we added hops, we tried, a mid-fermentation dry hop that we pulled out. We didn't think we needed it. We think it muddied the waters a little bit. We do a post-fermentation dry hop, which I think tones down the thiol expression a bit, which was very helpful. It took probably 3 or 4 tries before we really got to the point where we're like, okay, we've got something here that's incredibly drinkable and incredibly flavor forward, but not intimidating. And it's been fun. And I'll give a shout out to our marketing team because when they listened to me talk about this beer and how innovative this yeast was and how excited we were as a brewing team about it, and then they came up with this name Psychedelic Rabbit, which means nothing, but the imagery behind it, it's all, Jefferson Airplane, White Rabbit, Alice in Wonderland stuff, so It's got this kind of fantasy imagery around it that really works, with the beer. And I think that's a big part of its success as well. I mean, if we had just called it, New Realm Transcendent IPA, it wouldn't have been a success. But I think it would have been much tougher sell. But when you come in armed with these bright, colorful packages and incredible artwork on the can, and then you talk about the beer and people taste the beer while they're looking at the can, it resonated with them. The whole package really, really came together, and I think that was a big part of its success as well. It certainly helped us sell the beer on its own merits.
Can I ask then, what's the language that you guys use, or to explain this thiolized yeast? Is there a specific language that you guys have settled on as good for the consumer? Or?
Yeah, what we did is, our message is, number one, we talk about the flavor profile of the beer and where it falls in between, in comparison to West Coast and hazy. But we say it's a very special yeast strain. We talk about how much research is going on with brewers' yeast right now. And essentially the message is this is an amazing new yeast strain that allows these these flavor compounds that are bound up in malt and hops to be released and express themselves as this intense tropical fruit. And we keep it about that level. We don't go any further into, the compounds themselves, or, we don't even talk about thiols that much. We just say this yeast just releases all these flavors that normally you can't taste in the beer, but they're there naturally in the ingredients.
That's cool. Yeah, I like it. I like talking about thiols that way, and being able to share that is a huge thing, right? To be able to, for your marketing team to be able to market that beer and for it to rise in the popularity that it's got, it's important to talk about that. And so, Laura, I wanted to talk real quick about experimenting with these different yeast strains to try to achieve that balance. And let's kind of weave in too, if we can, so what are some factors that maybe you should be looking at to achieve balance?
Sure. Well, so in the New Brewer article, we kind of outline 3 different experiments, which helps you kind of hone in on what these compounds are, how dry hopping intensity plays in, and how they work in your recipe. So just as a baseline, it's nice to have kind of a blonde ale where you're going to brew it, and you would use kind of the standard brewing strain as your control, and then use one of the thiolized yeast as kind of the experimental. And with that, you're just really identifying kind of the attributes of thiols, like what do those compounds smell like in beer, in a base beer without a lot of competing aroma. And so that's really effective just to get your hands on what these are. And it will tell you that if you're not in balance, it can be polarizing or overwhelming. So that's a good exercise on its own. If you want to make a base beer like a blonde with these yeasts, or lager with these yeasts, ways to dial it back and kind of temper that thiol aroma is to, you can blend yeast. So you can use thiolized, non-thiolized yeast as a blend, and it really dials down like a kind of whatever ratio you want of thiol intensity. And then adjusting the malt. Basically, we know the precursor for the thiols is in barley malt, but it varies on barley malt varieties. It also varies in that it's not in wheat or oats. So if you're adjusting your grist to use different barley varieties or to use more wheat and oats, it's going to drop the thiol intensity depending on where the precursor is. So that's kind of a just basic level of how do you get thiols and what are they? And then the dry hop intensity is the other. I think Mitch actually mentioned this with the psychedelic rabbit. So make the beer, the blonde, and you're going to ferment both batches with thiolized yeast. So now the control is the non-dry hop beer, and the experimental is the dry hop beer. And you're going to get thiol intensity in the non-dry hop beer, and then you're going to see how that intensity is dialed back with hop intensity. They're competing. They're kind of both wanting to take center stage in the dry hop beer. And that's kind of what Mitch said, where that late dry hop they do tempers thiols for them, brings it in balance, makes it so that's not the only aroma that's coming through. And then the last experiment we talked about was just, if you have a beer you love, a beer that you brew all the time, one really great way to see how thiols would impact a recipe is just to swap that yeast out. So if you're using our British 5 in a hazy IPA, you can use Heliogazer and just see how thiols impact the recipe that you currently use. And that's kind of a fun way to know when you're really familiar with your recipe.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point too, right? Like you said, like a British 5 and Heliogazer. So a lot of the thiolized strains are from parent strains that are very common brewing strains, just with the thiol character kicked up. So that's a really fun and easy experiment to do. Is like you mentioned, just brew the parent strain with the thiol strain. But like you said, in that third experiment, if you're already got a beer that you really like and you're happy with, but you want to know how thiol is going to impact it, well, use the thiolized version of the yeast that you're already fermenting with, and then see what the changes are and see if you like those.
Yeah, and you can do all 3 experiments in one and have I think the way Mitch probably envisioned this was kind of taking all of those theories and placing it into that middle category. It wasn't West Coast, it wasn't hazy. We're building kind of complex aromas from yeast and how do we balance that and create the experience we're going for. So.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And from what I hear you say there too, that sounds like there's a lot of levers to play with here. Because one thing you said is just a base blonde ale. But a base blonde ale, if malt is a huge source of thiols, picking your malt could change, that base blonde ale and how that thiol expresses.
Yeah, I'm curious, Mitch, have you guys have you tried any other base malts? Have you seen any variation in what you've worked with? I mean, I know you said you did the kind of fruited wheat versus the psychedelic rabbit. There's probably aspects there that kind of played in with the malt.
Yeah, I think, and I remember hearing you say at some point, that wheat malt did not have the precursors and the bound thiols, and we were like, oh, that explains a lot, 'cause the psychedelic rabbit. So the very first test that led to that beer was with a West Coast IPA that we fermented with California ale yeast. That's our house clean ale yeast, and so when Star Party came out and we're like, okay, that is the thiolizing version of that yeast. That's what we're gonna try this and see what happens. When we first developed Psychedelic Rabbit, we had wheat malt in it, and we pulled it out after seeing some of your research on that, and we definitely saw a bump in we just went with standard American 2-row. I haven't done much else with that lately. Just the wheat malt and the American 2-row are really the only two things that we've been playing around with. And one of the other things that we tried that we ended up not pursuing, but our number one selling beer is a hazy IPA, and it uses a fair amount of wheat malt. And we didn't think that the thiol expression was going to be able to get it to replicate what we were getting with the mid-firm dry hop and the juiciness. And so we've kind of walked away from that research, although we're looking at revisiting it again. So yeah, I think it does manifest itself, depending on what malt you're using. I'd like to really, do formal trials with this kind of thing and just really understand it better. But, so we also got to get beer out the door. So my innovation bandwidth is not as much as it would be. If in a perfect world, I'd have a brewery that was only doing this kind of work, research work, and you got to be a lot bigger than us to be able to support that.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't do a ton of it, but when we were in our early thiol trials and we were not being consistent with our base malt, it became very obvious to us. We were seeing dramatic swings, and we didn't want it to be the yeast that was making that difference. So we figured out that it was linked to the malt, and that was very impactful because some batches would come out really low in thiol intensity, and we kind of, oh wow, that German Pilsner malt isn't really giving us a lot of thiol precursor. So yeah.
Oh, that would be interesting to see too. I'd love to see something like that shows like, okay, yeah, here's a Pilsner malt, here's a 2-row, here's caramel. I mean, I don't know what if things are burning off during the
caramel definitely. Actually, yeah. So I think it might be Cecile that had her paper on looking at it was stewing and roasting is terrible for thiol precursor. You don't get any expression out of any roasted or stewed malt. So you're going for lightly kilned. Munich actually has a little bit more precursor than base 2-row. So as long as you're not, I think with the modification and the process of making the Munich and developing some color, it actually isn't losing precursor. It's actually continuing to produce through the malting process, which is kind of crazy.
That is crazy. That is crazy.
Yeah, but those studies are really interesting. They're only beginning, so we'll get more information. There's going to be people putting more work out on that.
Yeah, of course. So there is that malt interaction there that's going to mix things up with different malt strains may be producing different thiolized characters, or maybe some similar ones, which would also be sort of interesting to know too. And then, of course, we talked about blending the thiolized strain with its parent strain. Laura, you mentioned that. And then, Mitch, I wanted to ask a little bit about like hopping and some of these yeast hopping interactions. You already mentioned, that you've pulled, the mid fermentation dry hop out of Psychedelic Rabbit in favor of that post fermentation dry hop to sort of tamp down those thiolized yeasts. Are you constantly sort of, when you're using these thiolized yeasts, are you constantly sort of making those decisions when modulating the recipe, like when and how to add hops and also which hops to add and those sorts of decisions?
Yeah, we are. I think with the double IPA example that I talked about a little bit earlier, that's really where we've been focusing on that. Trying to get a beer that doesn't need 3 pounds per barrel in the dry hop, and getting some additional flavor off the yeast fermentation, and that's been very helpful. And the hop combination, you don't want the hops to clash with the thiols, I think in Psychedelic Rabbit, we picked a couple of hops that have some tropical fruit expression already, so it just kind of blended in with the flavors. But then we threw in some citra hops and got some citrus in there as well, and it just kind of complemented things really well. But I would wonder whether Simcoe would clash or whether it would play well with the thiols, and things like that. So we do play around with it a bit. And I think, there's more to come on our end as we get into, brand planning for next year and what we want to do and how we want our beers to taste. But it's been a lot of fun. The Psychedelic Rabbit, we also use cashmere in it, which it really does great in the beer. And I'm not sure exactly why, but it's not too intense of a hop. It's got wonderful flavor, and it's a hop that plays well with others, in my opinion, so it's a hop that's a great hop to use in combination with another hop. And we had been using it in some special releases, and I just thought it might be interesting to toss in there. So the citra wasn't too dominant, and the thiol wasn't too dominant, and we like the way it turned out.
Yeah. I was also going to ask some questions too about like hop timing. So, you've got the post fermentation dry hop in Psychedelic Rabbit, but what about things like Whirlpool or mash hopping? That was one from Laura's article that you mentioned, Laura. You want to talk about? You want to do the mash hopping, or you want Mitch to do it? Which one, Laura?
Well, briefly, we did early work on mash hopping, especially with Cosmic Punch, and that was that less expression that we were trying to amplify. I think we usually advise customers that the barley malt's going to provide so much precursor for the Pat B strains, so Star Party and Heliogazer, that mash hopping, it's probably less economical. You're not necessarily needing to add more hops anymore. You're getting enough of the thiol precursor as in the base malt. So we don't really recommend doing any precursor supplements with these new Pat B strains, because they reach the intensity kind of that most people are happy with.
Right.
And actually, as another aside, when we initially launched these strains, they were higher in intensity, but to hedge success for customers, we actually pulled them back a little bit. And we were just seeing this occasional edge that was being kind of tipped over, where thiols were becoming less pleasant than they were pleasant. And for us, it was just really important for everybody to have the better experience and bring them down a little bit.
Mm-hmm. But with the IRC7 strains like Cosmic Punch, something like mash hopping might actually boost thiol character?
Yeah, definitely. We saw a 20% increase on beers that we had a very small, like 0.5 pound per barrel dry mash hop addition. And
oh, wow.
So for, and actually some other work out of Sonia Collins' lab talks about the precursors in malt being, different composition than the precursors in hops and wine grapes. And what we were trying to do was actually to break the precursor in the hops down in the mash with the protease activity in the mash to bring them into more of the intermediate glucose forms and the cysteine form, which we didn't talk that granular into precursor, but there's really a 4 different steps of like processing through precursor to get to the final free thiol.
Yeah, and so mash hopping can sort of help with that processing piece of it. Yeah, I remember having that conversation with Cecile on a past episode of the podcast, which is cool. Mitch, have you guys tried mash hopping or playing around in that area?
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up. When we first brewed with Cosmic Punch, we mash hopped because that was the recommendation. And so we just carried that through. And when we started brewing Psychedelic Rabbit, we were mash hopping it as well. And we were using Cascade hops in the mash hop. And when we pulled the wheat malt out of Psychedelic Rabbit, we ended up the next batch pulling out the mash hop too, and trying to get that flavor a little more consistent. So we haven't been mash hopping Psychedelic Rabbit for about the past 3 months. And we still are very happy with the thiol expression that we're getting now, and then, I saw some research, recently about mash hopping and removing, iron.
Metals,
and the oxidation reduction risk by doing it. So we may explore going back to doing a mash hop, but we'll have to approach that pretty carefully. But yeah, it's interesting because mash hopping's been around for a while, and I always, we did it a lot at Stone, but we never really were able to figure out if it actually did anything for us. Because we hopped so much after that, that we never really got any understanding of how the hop expressed itself, from a mash hop. But we've done a little work with mash hopping, and I'm looking forward to doing a bit more.
That's cool. Yeah. So that's a recent change, 3 months. Wow.
Well, the other thing about mash hopping that's a little confusing is people tend to forget that when they put hops in before the boil, it can lead to bitterness.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Yeah.
So, you can't do 2 pounds per barrel in the mash really. So those mash additions are really just meant to be a very small addition to help to boost the precursor pool. But, that can lead to disaster if you're not thinking it through.
Yeah, and you started talking there, Mitch, about oxygen and iron and stuff, and that reminded me of one other thing that I don't want to forget about, because this was one thing that Laura and I were talking about, and I went, oh, that's really cool. We have to talk about that. It's this idea of shelf life and using a thiolized yeast. And so are you seeing impacts on shelf life when using thiolized yeast strains?
Yeah, we are a real positive impact. And what's happening, I think, is, the hop character is the first thing to fade as beer ages and sits on a shelf. And the free thiols that are expressed in the beer don't fade at the same rate. They don't. And so we've been able to extend the shelf life on some of the beers that we've used this yeast in, which has been wonderful for our sales team. They're very happy about that. So, like the Psychedelic Rabbit's got 2 months more on it than our standard IPAs right now.
Wow, that's amazing.
Just because the flavors are, the beer tastes more like what it did when it was fresh, at 6 months instead of 4 months, and that's been, we hadn't really thought that through about the potential of that when we brewed the beer, but, as we museum all of our beer and taste it occasionally, and, we keep some at room temperature and some cold, and we go through an exercise and taste them every 30 days just to make sure that they're holding up. And we get a lot of pressure from wholesalers and from our sales team to extend shelf life. And I'm kind of the shelf life Nazi, I guess. I don't extend shelf life unless I'm sure it's going to be okay. And that was one that we were able to do it with. And that's been a wonderful thing. And we're going through the same study now with the double IPAs that we're using Star Party in, just to see if we can extend the shelf life on those as well.
Yeah, that's really cool to hear that. A 2-month shelf life extension is big on an IPA, right? I mean, that's huge. We always hear about that. In my mind, it makes a ton of sense, because our first examples of
sensory for Thiolized or Sauvignon Blanc wines. And they were, I said, you should taste the recent vintage, but you can taste 2-year-old, 3-year-old Sauvignon Blanc wine from New Zealand and still get these Thiol aromas. So that's pretty wild.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. I mean, but it does make sense from my perspective too, because if those compounds, the thiols, are lasting a little longer, that means the fruitiness, right, is sticking around. That tropical flavor is sticking around. Whereas those were normally brought by hops, and who knows, degrading in the presence of oxygen or iron or whatever other compounds are causing those staling reactions. Those aren't hitting thiols in the same way. So this actually gives you a little bit more shelf stability on that. And that's good to hear you say that too, Mitch, that you're a Nazi about that, because I know for a lot of brewers, I mean, it's that same saying, right? 10 good beers to build a loyal consumer, 1 bad beer to lose them, right? And so, yeah, it is super important to monitor shelf life. So cool. Well, I always ask this at the end of the show. And Laura, I'll ask you this one first, because you should have been prepared for it. But if you want brewers to take away just one thing from today's episode, what would it be?
Well, I think the experimenting side of things, we went crazy on Thiolized for 3 years. I still love Thiolized. I think people come in their love and hate of it, but just to try to, convince yourself of things that you really do like, and also find out how they play best with the kind of your goals and how your consumer is going to react to them. But I admire how Mitch approached this, and that's why I was really, honestly, kind of hopeful that he was going to come on the show, because it's been, for me, inspiring to see him take that experimentation and build something, a second, third seller and a regional brand, and have a lot of success with it. So just keep experimenting. It's fun. We need to stay fresh and innovative, and not everything's going to work, and don't just give up.
Yeah, right. That comment about the yeast in Budweiser. Well, it depends on the beer. Well, we're talking about Budweiser, right? That's not the case anymore. We have so many other beers out there. But Mitch, if you want brewers to take away just one thing from today's episode, what would that be? Pretty much echoing what Laura said. Innovation's so important. Try it. See if you can find a way to make it work in one of your beers, and don't be afraid of a new flavor profile. Sometimes it takes a lot of work. And I think as an industry, we were much better at educating, beer drinkers and wholesalers 20 years ago than we are now. We've kind of, and I've been fairly vocal about this, so forgive me, but I'm just tired of everybody chasing trends. And I don't think that's how this industry was built. And I think, anything we can do to bring back and encourage true innovation in beer and in beer flavor, I think is going to ensure the success of craft beer as we move forward. Yeah. Ensuring true innovation, right? True innovation that's got legs, that's going to last for a long time. That isn't just, the black IPA, for example, or other, I'm sure there's lots of styles out there that have gone that way. Well, I want to thank you both so much for this. Has been a fantastic conversation talking about thiols, brewing with thiols, thiolized yeast, and both sharing your experiences. So Mitch, thank you so much for joining me for the first time in the Brew Lab, and I hope to have you back at some point in the future.
Yeah, I'd enjoy that. Thank you.
And Laura, of course, thank you for coming back again and sharing your experiences. We're always happy to have you.
Same. Thanks, Cade.
All right. Well, listeners, in the show notes, you will find a link to Laura Burns and Lance Shaner's article in The New Brewer, which was titled Thiolized Yeast 101. And let's go ahead and throw a link in there, too, for Mitch Steele's book, IPA, which was a fantastic resource for IPA. So if you haven't pulled that off the shelves yet, you should definitely take a look and grab that. Next week, Jordan and I will be back applying the science of this week's episode, and we'll see y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.
say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Greedy corporate mega stores, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a law in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. The Durbin-Marshall credit card bill would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, tell your lawmakers, hands off my rewards. Tell them to oppose the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill.